The Arctic wind hit Sarah Mitchell's face like frozen needles as she stepped off the transport skimmer at Grimstad Air Force Base. Around her, 17 other trainees moved with military precision, their visors already sinking to the command network, their boots finding perfect rhythm on the ice-slicked tarmac. Sarah pulled her standard-issue thermal jacket tighter and clutched her leather notebook against her chest. Grimstad Base rose from the Arctic cliffs like a fortress carved from black ice. The elite training facility was where the Air Force's best radar operators learned to guide F-22 Raptors through impossible weather conditions. Speed meant survival here. Hesitation meant failure. And failure meant you went home. "Look alive, people," barked Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane, their lead instructor. His voice cut through the howling wind like a blade. This isn't some cozy flight school. Grimstad produces the fastest, sharpest radar ops in the world. If you can't keep up with our pace, you don't belong here. The other trainees nodded eagerly, their eyes bright with ambition. Sarah said nothing. She opened her notebook and began sketching the wind patterns she observed, noting how the gusts curled around the radar towers and created micro-distortions in visibility. "What's that, Mitchell?" Sergeant Kane had appeared beside her, his pale, blue eyes fixed on her notebook. "Drawing pictures on your first day?" "Wind shear analysis, Sergeant," Sarah replied quietly. "The southern approach shows irregular patterns that could affect landing visibility." Kane's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Save the weather reports for the meteorology wing trainee. Here, we trust our instruments, not doodles." Behind him, a trainee named Derek Thompson snickered. "Looks like we got ourselves an artist," he whispered to the recruit beside him. The comment rippled through the group, earning a few more chuckles. Sarah closed her notebook without responding. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not yet. Inside the orientation hangar, holographic displays blazed to life above rows of sleek consoles. The other trainees dove in immediately, their fingers dancing across touch screens as they synced with the base's advanced radar systems. Sarah remained at the edge of the group, her attention drawn to the massive windows overlooking the runway. Through the reinforced glass, she could see storm patterns building on the horizon, subtle shifts in light and shadow that the base's automated systems might miss. Freeze Frame brought her coloring book, Derek muttered, loud enough for others to hear. The nickname stuck instantly, spreading through the group like wildfire. Sarah didn't react. She opened her notebook and continued her observations, recording the precise angle of sunlight reflecting off the ice, the way thermal updrafts created tiny distortions near the landing approach. Her handwriting was steady, methodical, the same way she'd documented weather patterns back home in Colorado, where her father had taught her to read the sky before trusting any instrument. On the digital roster, her name flashed briefly before fading to a pale green warning status. Someone had already flagged her for irregular training methods. The system moved fast at Grimstad, and it had no patience for anyone who didn't match their rhythm. As the orientation session ended, Junior Instructor Lieutenant James Walsh paused behind Sarah's chair. He glanced at her notebook with barely concealed disdain. "That's not how we do things here, Mitchell," he said quietly. "You might want to adapt, and fast." Sarah nodded respectfully but didn't put her notebook away. That night, lying in her narrow bunk, she could hear the other trainees talking excitedly about flight simulators and radar locks and response times. None of them mentioned the storm, building outside, the one she'd been tracking all afternoon in her careful, handwritten notes. She had a feeling they'd need those notes sooner than they thought. The outcast, By the end of her first week at Grimstad, Sarah Mitchell had become invisible. Not the good kind of invisible that kept you out of trouble, the kind that marked you as a problem nobody wanted to solve. It started with the timed drills. Every morning, the trainees faced simulated radar scenarios designed to test their speed and accuracy. The goal was simple: identify incoming threats, confirm strike zones, and relay coordinates to pilots, all in under 8 seconds. The best operators at Grimstad could do it in 5. Sarah's first drill lasted 22 seconds. She'd spotted the simulated enemy aircraft immediately, but instead of rushing to confirm the target, she'd checked for atmospheric interference, verified the angular velocity against wind patterns, and cross-referenced the thermal signature with her handwritten weather logs. By the time she flagged the threat, Derek Thompson had already completed 3 scenarios. "Mitchell," Sergeant Kane's voice boomed across the training floor. "This isn't a nature walk. Lives depend on split-second decisions, not your little art." "Project!" The other trainees smirked. Sarah's careful analysis was correct, more accurate than most of their hasty identifications. But accuracy meant nothing without speed. At least that's what everyone believed. Her reassignment came without ceremony. Between Tuesday and Wednesday morning updates, Sarah's name simply vanished from the active radar operations board. No meeting, no explanation, just a new badge. On her desk and a console access code that no longer worked. "Logistics wing," Lieutenant Walsh informed her, with obvious satisfaction. "You'll be monitoring equipment returns and system calibrations. More your speed, I think." The logistics wing occupied the base's secondary level, tucked between the equipment storage bins and janitorial supplies. Sarah's new workstation faced a bank of observation monitors that most personnel left running in the background while they focused on more important tasks. The feeds showed raw visual data from various points around the base, useful for security, but hardly mission-critical. Most people would have been humiliated. Sarah was quietly fascinated. Within 3 days of starting her new assignment, she discovered something everyone else had missed: a data delay in one of the forward observation channels. It was tiny, less than a second, but enough to throw off timing calculations during landing sequences. She flagged the error and submitted a correction protocol. A technician implemented her fix the next morning without asking questions. The improvement was immediate and noticeable, but nobody connected it to the quiet trainee in logistics. Meanwhile, her old training group continued their high-speed drills, congratulating each other on their lightning-fast response times. During briefings, Sarah's former classmates would joke about manual override and the coloring book club. They'd made her a punchline, a cautionary tale about what happened when you couldn't keep up. But Sarah wasn't trying to keep up anymore. She was learning to see what they couldn't. During lunch breaks, she sat alone by the observation windows, eating military rations while tracking weather patterns across the base. Her notebook filled with precise measurements, wind velocity changes, thermal gradient shifts, the exact moment when sunlight hit the bay at angles that created optical distortions. One afternoon, as she was documenting unusual light refraction near the main runway, someone knocked her pencil to the floor. Derek Thompson walked past without stopping, grinning at his friends. Sarah bent down, retrieved her pencil, and continued writing. Her hand never shook. That evening, she ran unauthorized diagnostics on a stack of unused radar consoles in the equipment room. Nobody had asked her to do it, but she wanted to understand how signal drift affected accuracy under different atmospheric conditions. The results confirmed what she'd suspected. The base's rapid response protocols were creating blind spots that only careful observation could detect. Before lights out, Sarah passed through the main hallway one last time. Her name had been completely erased from the mission prep boards, replaced by a smiley face someone had drawn under the word observer. It wasn't subtle, but it was clear who it was meant for. Sarah didn't react. She returned to her bunk, opened her notebook, and began documenting the day's atmospheric data. Temperature drops, pressure changes, the exact wind speed that had rattled the radar towers just before sunset. Her worth had never been about how fast she could respond. It was about how clearly she could see. And tomorrow she had a feeling that clarity would matter more than anyone realized. 3 weeks into her exile in the logistics wing, Sarah Mitchell had found her rhythm. She arrived early, stayed late, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. Her notebook had grown thick with observations that nobody else bothered to make. Tiny details about weather patterns, equipment fluctuations, and the subtle environmental factors that could affect radar accuracy. She'd also discovered something troubling. The morning briefings had become a particular form of torture. Sarah wasn't officially required to attend, but logistics personnel were expected to stay informed about daily operations. She would sit in the back corner, invisible among the support staff, while the active trainees discussed their training progress and mock combat scenarios. Mitchell? Lieutenant Walsh's voice cut through the morning chatter like ice. He was reading from the digital roster, scanning for active personnel assignments. Wait, she's not... Someone remind me where Mitchell ended up? The room fell silent. Sarah felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward her corner. She's not one of us anymore, Derek Thompson's voice carried clearly across the briefing room. His tone was casual, dismissive, the kind of comment that would normally pass without notice. But this time, nobody corrected him. Nobody looked away. The silence stretched, until Lieutenant Walsh cleared his throat and moved on to the next name. Sarah marked the time in her notebook, 8:47 hours. Under a column titled Briefing Status, she wrote a single word, excluded. Then she closed the page and sat quietly through the rest of the meeting. That afternoon brought the incident that would change everything. Sarah was monitoring the visual observation feeds when she noticed something unusual. On the screen displaying the main runway approach, there was a shimmer, a subtle distortion in the light that didn't match the surrounding snow patterns. It was barely visible, the kind of optical anomaly that most people would dismiss as atmospheric interference. But Sarah had been tracking atmospheric conditions all morning. The weather was stable, the air clear. There shouldn't have been any distortion at all. She adjusted the camera resolution and enhanced the contrast. The shimmer remained, a faint but persistent irregularity in the otherwise uniform landscape. Something was down there, hidden beneath the snow. Sarah reached for her communication headset, then hesitated. Her last 3 equipment reports had been implemented without acknowledgement. Her atmospheric observations were dismissed as unnecessary detail. Who would listen to her concerns about a barely visible shimmer on a security feed? The decision was made for her when the alert came over the base communication system. Raptor flight inbound, preparing for landing sequence on runway Alpha 7. Sarah's blood ran cold. Runway Alpha 7 was exactly where she'd spotted the distortion. She grabbed her headset and switched to the control tower frequency. Control, this is Observer Station 2. I'm seeing a possible obstruction on runway Alpha 7 coordinates. She rattled off the precise location based on her calculations. The response was delayed, followed by a sound she'd learned to recognize, barely contained laughter. Observer 2, we show all clear on runway approach. Please verify your readings. Sarah looked at her screen again. The shimmer was still there, faint but undeniable. She could feel her heart pounding, but her voice remained steady. Control, I'm showing consistent optical distortion at the specified coordinates. Recommend visual confirmation before landing clearance. This time the laughter wasn't hidden. Copy that, Observer 2. We'll be sure to watch out for ice ghosts. The channel went quiet except for static. Sarah stared at her screen, watching the shimmer that everyone else had dismissed. In 15 minutes, a multi-million-dollar fighter jet carrying a human being would attempt to land directly over whatever was causing that distortion. She opened her notebook and began writing. Visual anomaly confirmed. Optical distortion inconsistent with current atmospheric conditions. Recommendation ignored by control tower. Then she added a line that surprised even her. Preparing independent verification protocol. Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 weeks being dismissed, mocked, and forgotten. But she'd also spent 3 weeks learning every system, every procedure, and every backup protocol on the base. If the official channels wouldn't listen to her, she'd find another way to make them see. The Raptor was 12 minutes out, and Sarah was done being invisible. Fighting back. Sarah's hands moved across her console with quiet precision. If Control Tower wouldn't authorize a visual inspection of the runway, she'd have to create her own verification. 3 weeks in the logistics, Wing had taught her exactly which system she could access without triggering security alerts. The base's observation drones were technically under maintenance rotation, but Sarah had noticed that Drone Unit 7 still showed active status in the secondary systems. More importantly, she'd discovered that logistics personnel had limited override authority for equipment testing purposes, a loophole designed to help technicians verify repairs. Sarah activated Drone Unit 7 and began programming a low-altitude reconnaissance pattern over runway Alpha 7. On her screen, the shimmer remained exactly where she'd first spotted it, a subtle but persistent distortion that made her stomach clench with certainty. "Observer, 2 to control," she transmitted, her voice calm despite her racing pulse. "I'm initiating visual confirmation of runway conditions using available resources." The response came back sharp and annoyed. "Observer 2, you are not authorized. For independent reconnaissance, return to standard monitoring protocols immediately." Sarah didn't respond. The drone was already airborne, its camera feed appearing on her secondary monitor. She guided it toward the coordinates where the shimmer appeared strongest, adjusting altitude and angle to get the clearest possible view. At first, the camera showed only snow, wind-packed and pristine, exactly what everyone expected to see. But as Sarah fine-tuned the drone's position, angling the camera to match the light reflection that had created the shimmer, something dark began to emerge from beneath the white surface. "Control, Raptor flight is 8 minutes out," a voice crackled over the communications system, requesting final clearance for runway Alpha 7. Sarah's drone camera locked into position, and suddenly she could see it clearly, a dark, angular shape buried under the snow. It was long, metallic, and positioned directly in the flight path. A refueling sled that had been abandoned during the last equipment rotation, invisible to ground sensors, but exactly where a landing fighter jet would touch down. Her heart hammered as she switched to emergency frequency. "Control, this is Observer 2. I have visual confirmation of debris on runway Alpha 7, uploading drone footage now." The communications channel went dead silent. Sarah could almost feel the shift in atmosphere as her drone feed appeared on screens throughout the control tower. The buried sled was undeniably there, captured in high-definition clarity. "Raptor flight, control, hold your pattern. We have a possible runway obstruction." Sarah heard rapid typing in the background, voices speaking in urgent, clipped tones. On her screen, the drone continued to circle, broadcasting the obstruction from multiple angles. The shimmer she'd noticed was now clearly visible as sunlight reflecting off the buried metal. "Control," Raptor Lead. "Can you confirm obstruction?" "Status?" A different voice responded this time, calmer, more senior. "Confirmed, Raptor Lead. Debris identified on runway approach, holding all traffic until cleared." Sarah saved the drone footage to multiple backup systems and began typing a detailed report. Timestamp, coordinates, photographic evidence, atmospheric. Conditions that had made the obstruction visible. Everything documented with the same meticulous care she'd applied to her daily observations. 20 minutes later, ground crews reached the buried sled. Sarah watched through her drone's camera as two heavy vehicles dragged the metal obstruction clear of the runway, ice cracking and falling away to reveal the full scope of what had been hidden. The sled was massive, easily large enough to destroy any aircraft that hit it. Her console chimed with an incoming message. Sarah opened it to find a single line from an unknown sender. "Observer 2. Nice catch. Raptor Lead." She printed the message and tucked it into her notebook, then returned to monitoring the runway. The crisis was over, but Sarah knew something fundamental had changed. For the first time since arriving at Grimstad, people weren't dismissing her observations. They were studying them. In the control tower, she could imagine officers reviewing the drone footage, wondering how they'd missed something so obvious. More importantly, wondering how the trainee they'd exiled to logistics had spotted what their advanced systems couldn't detect. Sarah opened her notebook and wrote a simple entry. Visual confirmation. Successful. Runway obstruction cleared. Independent verification protocols effective. She didn't write about vindication or satisfaction. Those emotions felt too small for what had happened. Instead, she documented the precise wind conditions that had created the shimmer, the light angle that had made detection possible, and the systematic approach that had turned her quiet observations into life-saving action. Tomorrow, she suspected, people would start paying attention to her notebooks in a very different way. The tables turn. The summons came at 600 hours, delivered by a junior officer who wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. Report to Conference Room Alpha. Immediately. Bring your logs. Sarah gathered her notebooks, she now kept 3, filled with months of detailed observations, and made her way through Grimstad's corridors. For the first time since her reassignment, other personnel nodded to her as she passed. Word had spread quickly about the runway obstruction, and more importantly, about who had spotted it. Conference Room Alpha was packed. Sarah recognized faces. From every level of the base hierarchy, flight instructors, operations officers, even Colonel Elizabeth Hayes, Grimstad's commanding officer. At the front of the room, a large screen displayed frozen footage from her drone reconnaissance. The buried sled captured in perfect clarity. Mitchell. Colonel Hayes' voice was crisp, authoritative. "Take a seat." Sarah sat in the chair, indicated, her notebooks resting on her lap. The room felt charged with tension, though she couldn't determine if it was hostile or simply intense. "That obstruction," Colonel Hayes continued, pointing to the screen, was not visible to any of our standard detection systems. No radar signature, no surface sensors, no thermal imaging. According to our records, it had been buried there for 6 days. 6 days during which we conducted 17 landing operations on that runway. The colonel paused, letting that information settle. The obstruction was identified through visual observation of atmospheric distortion patterns by... She consulted. Her notes. Observer, Station 2. You. Sarah nodded once but said nothing. "I want to understand your methodology," Colonel Hayes said. "Walk us through exactly how you detected an invisible object using equipment that every other operator on this base dismissed as secondary monitoring." Sarah opened her primary notebook to the entries from the previous day. The shimmer appeared at 13:47 hours during optimal lighting conditions. Based on my atmospheric tracking, there was insufficient environmental interference to account for the optical distortion. The anomaly was consistent across multiple observation periods, suggesting a fixed source rather than weather-related phenomena. She turned to another page. Cross-referencing with base equipment logs showed a missing refueling sled from the previous rotation. Probability calculations indicated the sled's last known position aligned with the distortion coordinates. The room was completely silent. Sarah could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. Major Robert Chen, one of the senior flight instructors, leaned forward. "You've been tracking atmospheric conditions manually this entire time?" "Yes, sir. Standard digital systems average environmental data over 15-minute intervals. Manual. Observation captures micro changes that automated systems filter out as irrelevant noise." Major Chen looked at Colonel Hayes, then back at Sarah. "Show us your prediction models." Sarah opened her second notebook, revealing pages of hand-drawn charts and calculations. Wind pattern predictions, temperature gradient analyses, pressure, system tracking, all documented with the same careful precision that had identified the runway obstruction. "These are more detailed than our meteorological reports," admitted Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the Weather Office. "How accurate are your predictions?" "I can provide verification data," Sarah replied quietly. She opened her third notebook, showing columns of predictions matched against actual conditions. Her accuracy rate exceeded 93%. Colonel Hayes studied the numbers for a long moment. "Mitchell, you were reassigned to logistics because your response times didn't meet our training standards. But it appears your observational accuracy exceeds our institutional standards." "Significantly." The colonel stood and faced the room. "I want every officer in this room to understand something. Yesterday, Mitchell prevented what could have been a catastrophic accident using methods that we've been dismissing as outdated and inefficient. Her slow approach identified a threat that our fast systems completely missed." She turned back to Sarah. "Effective immediately, you're reinstated to active radar operations. More than that, you're being assigned to develop new observation protocols based on your methodology. We're integrating manual verification requirements into our standard procedures." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, but a quiet recognition that her way of seeing the world had finally found its place. "There's one more thing," Colonel Hayes added. "The pilot you helped yesterday has requested to work with you directly. He wants to understand how you spotted what everyone else missed." After the meeting, as officers filed out of the conference room, several approached Sarah directly. Lieutenant Walsh, who had originally dismissed her methods, stopped beside her. "Chair, I owe you an apology, Mitchell," he said quietly. "Your approach, it's not what we're used to, but it's effective. Would you be willing to train some of our junior operators?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." That afternoon, she returned to the Radar Operations Center for the first time in 2 months. Her old workstation had been updated with new equipment. Dual monitors, enhanced resolution cameras, and a direct link to atmospheric monitoring systems. On the desk, someone had placed a new set of notebooks and a collection of pencils, still in their packaging. But the most significant change was in how people looked at her. The smirks and dismissive glances were gone, replaced by curiosity and respect. Derek Thompson, who had coined the freeze-frame nickname, actually approached her station. "Mitchell," he said awkwardly, "I wanted to... That is, could you show me how you spotted that obstruction? I've been going over the footage and I still can't see what you saw." Sarah opened her notebook to a fresh page. It starts with understanding what you're actually looking at, she said. Most people see what they expect to see, but if you know how to look for what doesn't belong. She began sketching the atmospheric conditions that had made the shimmer visible, explaining each factor with the same patient precision she'd applied to her solitary observations. For the first time since arriving at Grimstad, Sarah Mitchell was teaching instead of being taught. And she was finally home. Respect earned. 2 weeks after her reinstatement, Sarah Mitchell had become the most sought-after instructor at Grimstad Base. Her calendar was packed with individual training sessions, and her observational methodology was being studied by officers from 3 different air bases. The transformation was complete, but it hadn't come with fanfare. It had come with results. The morning briefing room, once a place of humiliation, now felt entirely different. Sarah sat in the front row, her notebooks open, as Colonel Hayes addressed the assembled personnel. Our new integrated observation protocols have improved threat detection accuracy by 47%, the Colonel announced. More importantly, we've eliminated the blind spots that traditional automated systems created. This improvement is directly attributable to the manual verification methods developed by radar analyst Mitchell. Sarah's title had changed officially. No longer Observer 2, but Senior Radar Analyst with specialized authority over atmospheric observation protocols. Her workstation now occupied a central position in the Radar Operations Center, and her recommendations carried the same weight as senior officers. But the most meaningful change was smaller and more personal. Mitchell, a voice called as she left the briefing room. She turned to see Captain James Morrison, the Raptor pilot, whose landing she'd prevented. He was carrying a coffee cup and looked slightly nervous. "Captain," Sarah acknowledged. "I wanted to thank you again," he said. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't caught that obstruction. My co-pilot has 2 kids. The mathematical probability of survival on impact." Sarah nodded. "I'm glad the system worked." Morrison smiled. "That's just it. The system didn't work. You worked. Your eyes, your patience, your refusal to trust what everyone else was seeing." He paused. "I've requested permanent assignment to operations that include your oversight. I want to fly knowing that someone with your attention to detail is watching the approach." Word of Morrison's request had spread quickly through the pilot community. Within days, Sarah had received similar requests from 5 other pilots. Her reputation had shifted from liability to asset, and the demand for her specialized skills was growing beyond Grimstad's capacity. The real test came during her first major weather event since reinstatement. A severe Arctic storm had developed rapidly, creating conditions that pushed Grimstad's detection systems to their limits. Visibility was near zero, wind patterns were chaotic, and 3 emergency medical flights needed to land within a 6-hour window. Sarah positioned herself at her enhanced workstation, multiple screens displaying overlapping data streams. But her primary focus remained her notebooks, where she tracked atmospheric changes minute by minute, building a predictive model that no computer system could replicate. "Mitchell," came the voice of Major David Park from Flight Operations. "Medical. Flight 1 is requesting approach clearance. Conditions are marginal at best." Sarah consulted her latest entries. The storm was creating multiple thermal layers that would confuse standard radar returns, but she'd identified a brief window where visibility would improve just enough for a guided approach. Medical 1, approach authorized at 1847 hours. Wind will shift to northwest at 12 knots, reducing crosswind interference. Thermal ceiling will lift to 400 feet for approximately 7 minutes. The pilot's response crackled with static. "Copy. Control. How confident are you in that?" "Timing?" Sarah looked at her calculations. Atmospheric pressure trends, wind pattern analysis, temperature gradient measurements, all pointing to the same conclusion. "Highly confident, Medical 1. Window opens in 4 minutes 30 seconds. The room fell quiet as everyone watched their instruments, waiting to see if Sarah's manual predictions would prove accurate. At exactly 1847 hours, the wind shifted, the thermal ceiling lifted, and Medical Flight 1 touched down safely in conditions that would have been impossible moments earlier. The pattern repeated twice more that evening. Each time, Sarah's handwritten. Calculations provided landing windows that automated systems couldn't detect. By midnight, 3 emergency flights had been completed successfully in weather that should have grounded all operations. Colonel Hayes appeared at Sarah's workstation as the storm finally passed. "Analyst Mitchell, I've just received a call from Pacific Air Command. They want to discuss implementing your observation protocols at 12 additional bases." Sarah looked up from her notebooks where she was documenting the evening's atmospheric data for future reference. "Ma'am, they're offering you a promotion to technical specialist and assignment to develop training programs for manual observation techniques. You'd be traveling to bases across the Pacific Theater, teaching other operators your methodology." The offer was remarkable, a chance to transform how the entire Air Force approached atmospheric observation. Sarah considered it carefully, then shook her head. "With respect, Colonel, I'd prefer to remain at Grimstad. This is where the work is most effective, and there's still a lot to learn about optimizing the integration between manual and automated systems." Colonel Hayes smiled. "I hoped you'd say that. The truth is, we can't afford to lose you. Your presence here has changed how this entire base operates." That night, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the day's entries. Her notebooks now filled an entire shelf, representing months of careful observation and documentation. But more than data, they represented a fundamental shift in how Grimstad approached the challenge of seeing clearly in an environment designed to hide the truth. On her desk, she found a handwritten note from Derek Thompson. "Thanks for teaching me how to really look. I spotted something today that I would have missed before." Sarah smiled and filed the note in her notebook. Tomorrow would bring new weather patterns, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that sometimes the oldest methods were still the most reliable. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began planning the next day's observations. Outside her window, the Arctic night was clear and still, full of details that only careful eyes could see. The final vindication. 6 months after the runway obstruction incident, Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at Pentagon headquarters, delivering the keynote address at the annual Military Aviation Safety Conference. The invitation had come directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and her presentation would be broadcast to airbases worldwide. "Manual atmospheric observation," Sarah began, her voice calm and clear, "is not about rejecting technology. It's about understanding the limitations of automation and maintaining the human capacity to see what machines cannot." Behind her, a large screen displayed before and after statistics from Grimstad base. A 68% improvement in threat detection accuracy, 0 weather-related incidents in 6 months, and a 94% pilot satisfaction rating with the new integrated observation protocols. In the audience, she recognized faces from her journey: Colonel Hayes, Major Park, Captain Morrison, and even Derek Thompson, who had become one of her most successful students. But the face that meant the most was in the front row. Her father, retired Air Force Master Sergeant Robert Mitchell, who had taught her to read the sky long before she'd ever heard of Grimstad base. "The human eye," Sarah continued, "processes approximately 10 million bits of information per second. Our brains can detect patterns and anomalies that would require massive computational power to identify automatically. The question isn't whether we should trust our instruments, it's whether we can afford not to trust our own observations." She clicked to the next slide showing footage from the runway obstruction incident. This debris was invisible to radar, thermal imaging, and ground sensors. It was detected through careful observation of atmospheric distortion patterns. Technique that requires patience, practice, and the willingness to trust what you see over what you're told you should see. The audience was completely silent, absorbed in footage that had become legendary throughout the Air Force. But the real lesson isn't about one dramatic save, Sarah said. It's about the hundreds of small observations that prevent problems before they become emergencies. Every day, manual atmospheric monitoring at Grimstad base identifies conditions that automated systems miss. Wind shears that would create turbulence. Pressure variations that affect fuel efficiency. Thermal layers that distort radar returns. She clicked to her final slide, a photograph of her workstation at Grimstad, notebooks open beside state-of-the-art, monitoring equipment, integration, not replacement, technology enhanced by human observation, not diminished by it. The applause was immediate and sustained. As Sarah stepped down from the podium, she was surrounded by officers requesting information about implementing similar programs at their bases. The methodology she'd developed in Exile had become the new standard for atmospheric observation throughout the Air Force. Later that evening, at the reception following her presentation, Sarah found herself in conversation with General Patricia Williams, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Analyst Mitchell, General Williams said, "I want to discuss your next assignment. We're creating a new position. Director of Integrated Observation Protocols. You'd oversee the implementation of your methodology at every airbase in the continental United States." Sarah considered the offer carefully. "General, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'd like to propose an alternative. Instead of centralizing oversight, what if we focused on training regional specialists? Each base developing expertise in their specific environmental conditions while maintaining the core observational principles?" General Williams smiled. "You want to teach people to think like you rather than think for them." "Exactly, ma'am. The strength of manual observation is in the individual observer's connection to their specific environment. That can't be replicated through centralized management." The general nodded approvingly. "Very well. We'll establish regional training centers with you as lead curriculum developer. How does Technical Director Sarah Mitchell sound?" "It sounds like an opportunity to help people see clearly," Sarah replied. 3 days later, Sarah returned to Grimstad base to find her workstation decorated with congratulations cards from pilots, technicians, and trainees. But the most meaningful surprise was waiting in her quarters. A new leather notebook with her name embossed on the cover, along with a note from her original training class. To freeze frame, the note read, "Who taught us that sometimes you have to slow down to see what really matters. Thank you for showing us how to look. Your classmates." Sarah opened the notebook to its first blank page and began writing. Day 247 at Grimstad base. Clear skies, wind from the northwest at 8 knots, exceptional visibility. Perfect conditions for observation and learning. Outside, her window, the Arctic landscape stretched endlessly under a brilliant sky. Somewhere out there, new trainees were learning to trust their instruments, to move fast, to keep up with the pace that Grimstad demanded. And now, thanks to Sarah's quiet persistence, they were also learning to trust their eyes, to notice what others missed, and to understand that sometimes the most important skill was simply knowing how to see. Sarah smiled and continued writing. There was always more to observe, more to document, and more to learn. And finally, there were people willing to listen. Full circle. 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell walked through the same corridors of Grimstad base where she'd once been invisible. Now her presence commanded immediate attention and respect. The The Mitchell method of integrated atmospheric observation had been implemented at 43 bases worldwide, and she'd personally trained over 200 specialists. But today was different. Today, she was returning to where it all began. The logistics wing, where she'd spent those crucial months learning to see what others missed. Director Mitchell called Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, sister to the officer who had once dismissed her methods. Jennifer was part of the new generation of radar operators trained from the beginning in integrated observation techniques. The new trainee class is ready for their first manual observation exercise. Sarah nodded and followed Jennifer to the familiar observation room. 18 new trainees sat at workstations, notebooks open, pencils ready. But unlike her own experience, they weren't being exiled here. They were beginning their most important training. Today you'll learn why instruments alone aren't enough, Sarah addressed the class. You'll discover that your eyes, properly trained, can detect threats that million-dollar systems miss entirely. In the back row, she noticed one trainee struggling with the manual sketching exercise. The young woman, Rebecca Torres, was clearly frustrated, her movements quick and impatient as she tried to match the speed of her classmates. Sarah approached quietly. "Take your time, Torres. What do you see outside that window?" "Just snow, ma'am," Rebecca replied tersely. "Same as everyone else." Sarah sat down beside her. "Look again, not at what you expect to see, but at what's actually there. The way the light hits the surface, the patterns in the wind, the small details that make this moment different from any other." Rebecca looked skeptical, but followed Sarah's guidance. Slowly, her sketches became more detailed, more observant. "There's a thermal distortion near the eastern tower," she said suddenly. "It's subtle, but the air looks different there." "Excellent," Sarah said. "That distortion indicates a heating system malfunction that maintenance needs to address. You just prevented potential equipment failure through careful observation." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Really? Really? Your slow approach just identified something that would have taken our automated systems another 6 hours to detect." Sarah smiled. "Speed isn't everything, Torres. Clarity is." As the training session continued, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The mocking voices that had once called her freeze frame were now distant echoes. In their place were the voices of pilots who trusted her observations, trainees who valued her methods, and colleagues who respected her expertise. After class, Sarah made her way to the main briefing room where Colonel Hayes was conducting the weekly operations review. The same room where she'd once been dismissed now displayed her atmospheric observation charts as standard reference materials. "Director Mitchell," Colonel Hayes announced as Sarah entered. "Perfect timing. We just received confirmation that your integrated protocols prevented another potential incident at Ramstein Air Base. A trainee using your methodology spotted debris. That would have affected a medical evacuation flight." The room erupted in applause. Sarah nodded acknowledgement but felt more satisfaction than triumph. Each successful detection validated not just her methods, but the principle that human observation remained irreplaceable in an age of automation. That evening, Sarah returned to her original workstation in the logistics wing, now designated as the Mitchell Observation Laboratory and used for advanced training. She opened her current notebook, the 15th since arriving at Grimstad, and began documenting the day's atmospheric conditions. A knock at the door interrupted her writing. Captain Morrison stood in the doorway holding a folder. "Director," he said formally, then smiled. "Sarah, I wanted to show you something." He opened the folder to reveal photographs from around the world, air bases in Japan, Germany, Alaska, and Australia, all showing operators using notebooks and manual observation techniques alongside their digital equipment. These are all bases implementing your methodology, Morrison explained. 43 facilities, over 300 trained specialists, and a safety record that's the best in Air Force history. Sarah studied the photographs, seeing herself reflected in each careful observer hunched over their notebooks, sketching wind patterns and tracking atmospheric anomalies with the same methodical precision she'd developed in this very room. "There's something else," Morrison continued. He pulled out a final photograph, the Pentagon's main briefing room, where a large portrait now hung beside those of other Air Force pioneers. The nameplate read, "Technical Director Sarah Mitchell, Pioneer of Integrated Atmospheric Observation." Sarah traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. "I never wanted recognition," she said quietly. "I just wanted to do the work properly." "I know," Morrison replied. "That's exactly why you deserved it." After Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in the observation laboratory, surrounded by the tools that had transformed her from an outcast into an innovator. Her notebooks, her pencils, her patient approach to seeing what others missed, all of it, had found its place in a world that initially had no room for her methods. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, Year 2, Day 1. Atmospheric conditions optimal. New class of trainees showing excellent progress in manual observation techniques. The future of integrated atmospheric observation remains bright. Outside the window, the Arctic night was crisp and clear, stars visible in patterns that automated systems would catalogue but never truly see. Sarah smiled and continued writing, documenting details that would matter tomorrow, next week, or in some future moment when careful observation would again make the difference between safety and disaster. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Torres. "Ma'am, I spotted another thermal anomaly during evening patrol. Maintenance confirmed it was a developing problem that would have caused system failure by morning. Thank you for teaching me how to really look." Sarah saved the message and returned to her notebook. In the margin of her daily log, she wrote a single word: success. Not because she'd been vindicated or promoted or honored, but because another person had learned to see clearly in a world full of noise and distraction. Another observer had discovered that sometimes the most important skill wasn't speed or technology, but simply the patience to notice what everyone else overlooked. Sarah Mitchell closed her notebook and prepared to leave the laboratory. Tomorrow would bring new weather patterns, new challenges, and new opportunities to teach others the value of careful observation. She'd found her purpose in the quiet space between what people expected to see and what was actually there. And in that space, she'd learned that being called freeze frame had never been an insult. It had been a recognition of her greatest strength. The ability to pause, observe, and see the truth that constant motion obscured. As she turned off the lights and locked the laboratory door, Sarah reflected on the most important lesson of her journey. Sometimes you don't need to change to fit the world. Sometimes you need to trust that the world will eventually change to fit the truth you've been quietly documenting all along. The Arctic wind whispered against the windows, carrying patterns that only trained eyes could read. Sarah walked through the corridors of Grimstad Base, past sleeping trainees who would wake tomorrow to continue learning the art of seeing clearly. Her work here was complete, but it would never truly end. Somewhere, another careful observer was documenting details that seemed insignificant, but would someday save lives. Another slow trainee was learning that precision mattered more than speed. And in the morning, Sarah would begin teaching them all over again, one observation at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.